Welcome to the next revision video on Paper 2, the Cold War. This is looking at key topic 2, which is the Cold War crises from 1958 to 1970. So the tensions between the USSR and the USA had firmly been set, and we'd seen that obviously escalate over the late 1940s and through into the 1950s with the development of the arms race as well. This part of the course is obviously the height of tension before détente and after the establishment of and development of the Cold War. So we're going to talk through each of the crises that comes up in this key topic. So we're going to look at the second crisis over Berlin and look at the subsequent building of the Berlin Wall. We're going to talk about the Cuban Revolution and the installment of Fidel Castro as the communist dictator, and then the subsequent Cuban Missile Crisis. And then we're going to talk about the Prague Spring, the reforms led by Alexander Dubček, and the ending of those reforms and the ultimate Brezhnev Doctrine. We're going to start with the tension and the second crises that hit Berlin in the late 1950s, from 1958 through to 1961 in August with the construction of the Berlin Wall. As we know from the previous video, the first major crisis of the Cold War was centered around Berlin, as Berlin was divided into four zones, deep in East Germany, which was the Soviet zone. And then when East Germany is created, obviously as a communist state, the Soviets still have a lot of influence there. But in the middle of that, you have a thriving capitalist society in West Berlin. We know that Stalin had tried to push the Allies out of Berlin with the blockade. This had failed. The US had proved that they were not willing to subcede Berlin to communism, and they developed obviously the airlift. But the situation changes a little bit in the 1950s. So in 1955, West Germany joins NATO. So they are now part of that military alliance and have that military backing. And we start to see, as we mentioned in the previous video, President Eisenhower starts to deploy missiles in West Germany because West Germany is now part of NATO as well. In 1957, West Germany also joins a new organization called the European Economic Community, or EEC, as you can call it, which will essentially be the precursor to the European Union. And this means that West Germany's economic situation improves, and West Germany starts to go through an economic miracle at this stage as well. So in West Germany, which borders East Germany and the Eastern Bloc, and in West Berlin as well, there is now a potential economic and military threat to East Germany as well. The whole situation then starts to get out of hand with the refugee problem that takes place. It's what Khrushchev referred to as the brain drain. And what we see many families and people trying to escape communism, but also many skilled workers attempting to migrate from East Germany to West Germany and West Berlin as well, where their skills were going to be more highly paid in a capitalist society. Obviously, in a communist society, they are not receiving a higher wage. They are receiving the same wage that's set by the government. So from 1949 to 1961, there is approximately 4 million migrants crossing the border into West as well to start a new life as well. By January of 1961, the year that it really the crisis gets to a peak tension, there was about 20,000 people every month leaving the East for the West as well. So in 1958, Khrushchev issues in a speech in Moscow what's called his Berlin Ultimatum. And this is where he demanded that the Western powers leave Berlin within 6 months so Berlin could become a free city with its own independent government. Obviously, the intention was just to completely take over the city and engulf it and make it a part of the East Germany as well as the rest of the country. Eisenhower, the peacekeeper, as we talked about when we talked about the Hungarian Revolution / uprising, was keen for tensions not to escalate with the Soviet Union. Him and Khrushchev shared a mutual respect for one another. They'd both fought in the Second World War, and so he agrees to negotiate over Berlin, and he invites Khrushchev in 1959 to the United States, to Camp David, which is the the home outside of Washington, D.C. for the president. So again, showing that respect. Khrushchev, pictured there in the bottom left, famously wears a cowboy hat and goes to Disneyland and really enjoys himself. And they plan a summit for the following year in Paris in 1960. Now, that scheduled date for the Paris summit is the 14th of May, 1960. But 9 days prior to that, a U-2 spy plane belonging to the United States was reportedly shot down over the Soviet Union. Khrushchev had been worried about spying from West Berlin and espionage, so this kind of brought his fears to light. The pilot's captured and put on trial. At the summit, Khrushchev demands all U-2 flights stop, and he demands a personal apology from President Eisenhower. Now, Eisenhower was prepared to stop the U-2 flights over the Soviet Union, but he would not apologize. Quite stubborn. Bitter exchanges take place between the two of them, and the summit never takes place. And the most important consequence of this is that the question over Berlin and this issue of the migrants and the refugees is not solved. The following year, Khrushchev decides to try and arrange another summit, and he does so in June of 1961 in Vienna, in Austria. But the US presidential elections have led to a new elected president. Eisenhower's 2 terms are up, and there's a new president, the youngest president in American history, and that is John F. Kennedy, or JFK. Now, Khrushchev hopes that he can use Kennedy's youth and his inexperience to manipulate him, get his own way as well. And again, at Vienna, he demands that the Allies leave West Berlin and that he would cut off all routes to West Berlin if they did not leave, similar to Stalin in 1949. JFK is stronger than Khrushchev first imagines. He refuses, and instead he embarks on increasing US military spending by about $3.5 billion. The Soviets, in return, also start to increase their spending by about 30%. So again, we do not have a resolution on Berlin. Now, his ultimatum had stated that there would be severe consequences if the Western powers did not leave. And what we see is on the 12th and 13th of August, the border is shut between East and West Berlin, and a 27-mile barbed wire wall separates East and West Berlin. So Berliners wake up on the 13th of August 1961 to see that their city is now divided by a barrier and not just ideological. Before, you could go from east to west. Eventually, this would turn into a fully fledged wall, as you can see from the image there, with guard towers, machine guns, searchlights, and it would stretch 100 miles encircling West Berlin. It's often the misconception that there's west on one side and east on the other. It encircled it. And the tension here is high because Kennedy has been completely outmaneuvered. There's nothing that he could do in this situation because they built the wall around. But at Checkpoint Charlie, which was the area in Berlin which was essentially like the border, where you would have border control and passports, there is a standoff between tanks as well. Kennedy and Khrushchev see that war could break out, conflict could break out, and they do agree to remove the tanks as well. But the impact on Berliners is huge. Families are divided. There's desperate and dangerous attempts to try and cross the border. 130 are killed in the time that the Berlin Wall is standing, from 61 to 89. A teenager, Peter Fechter, is shot. He's 18 years old, and he's laid dying for 45 minutes in no man's land as well. So the human side is tragic regarding the wall. But what it actually does is the wall actually ends the tension over Berlin. It is a resolution, because the main reason that Khrushchev wants the Allies to leave is because this prosperous capitalist society in West Berlin was thriving, and millions of East Germans were migrating west, and the wall stops that. So once the refugee crisis is over, Khrushchev is quite content, and the fact that he looks strong. He outmaneuvered the popular and charismatic JFK as well. 2 years later, Kennedy finally visits Berlin. So he doesn't visit straight away, he visits 2 years later. Takes a 30-mile tour of the city. He meets lots of people, 1.5 million West Berliners come out to meet him. He speaks to 200,000 of them. He says, "Ich bin ein Berliner." He means to say that he is one of, I'm one of you. I am a Berliner. I live here like you. I'm one of you. In fact, he calls himself a donut. He should have just said, "Ich bin Berliner." He didn't need the ein. But this, crucially, as I said, is the end of the tension over Berlin. And it's not until the wall comes down, which is more symbolic, where we turn our gaze back to Berlin. The Cold War in the 60s goes global. And it was very much European focused in the 1940s and 1950s because of the end of the Second World War. But in the late 50s and the early 60s, we start to see the war go more global. There's a conflict in Korea between North and South, the Soviets backing the North, the Communists, the USA backing the South, South Korea. We start to see the development of the Vietnam War take place as well, but then we start to see an issue in Cuba as well. Now, Cuba is 90 miles away from the American mainland, and they have huge interests in Cuba. Lots of American companies owned industries in businesses in Cuba. It was a really popular holiday destination, and the repressive dictator of Cuba, Batista, who many believe was responsible for about 20,000 Cuban deaths of his own people, was backed by the USA. He was hugely unpopular. But Cuba, by and large, because of its close proximity to the US mainland, particularly Florida, 90 miles, and all of that investment, it was very much in the US sphere of influence as well. But in 1959, two revolutionaries lead a revolution to actually remove Castro, and that is Fidel Castro and famously Che Guevara. But Castro is the main man. Batista is usurped, he's removed from power, and he flees. He flees to Europe, where he eventually dies in the 1970s. Castro wants greater independence from the United States. So what he does is he takes control of all of the American industries in Cuba. Now, this was a huge alarm bell for the United States government, for Kennedy, because of the potential that communism was on America's doorstep. The one thing that they had feared that seemed like a faraway problem across the Atlantic Ocean was now very, very, very close to home. They react quite strongly and quite quickly. They attempt to cause Cuba economic problems. So they set sanctions on them. They ban the import of Cuban sugar, which was Cuba's main export. This could have potentially bankrupted Cuba at the time. So they turn to the Soviet Union, who were more than happy to purchase Cuban sugar, and we start to see a friendship, an alliance forged between Castro's Cuba and Khrushchev's Soviet Union. He doesn't do this with the goodness of his heart. He sees this as a perfect opportunity to undermine the US and have a communist state close to the US mainland. By 1959, he's also sending weapons to Cuba as well, and obviously that has an impact later on as well. The US response to this is that they end up breaking off diplomatic relations with Cuba in January of 1961, and they restart a scheme that they had begun under Eisenhower's government of training Cuban exiles. So people who had supported the Batista government, who had fled Cuba, had gone to Florida, which was a popular destination for exiles because of how close it was, and they restart this. And it's led by the CIA, the central agency of the United States government, and they train this group, and they're called La Brigada 2506. They had a budget of about $45 million, so it's it's got lots of money, and they start training to invade Cuba essentially and to remove Castro. But their plan is, or their belief is, that Castro is not popular, but they are very much misinformed, and this is a huge misjudgment. They number about 1,500. They land at the Bay of Pigs, which is where exiles would leave Cuba from, and that's where they land. But they're met by 20,000 battle-hardened Cuban revolutionaries. They'd misjudged Castro's popularity, as I mentioned, and Castro knew the invasion was coming. He had people in Florida who were giving them this information as well. As a result of this, his position became even stronger in Cuba. He becomes a bit of a cult hero in his military uniform, his huge cigar. But significantly, it showed that the US were weak, It was humiliating for Kennedy, just like the Berlin Wall crisis that would happen later on. And the US also started to lose support in Latin America. And later in the 1970s and 80s, many countries in Central America will start to turn to communism. Now, the most biggest consequence here is that Castro publicly announced that he was communist. So the fears of the US were realized, and he cemented his alliance with the Soviet Union. We know that this directly would lead to the Cuban Missile Crisis, because Khrushchev had found a willing ally and a possibility to actually put missiles on Cuba. Now, a year later, the 14th of October 1962, a U-2 spy plane is flying over Cuba, and it photographs multiple missile pads on Cuba. These were intermediate range ballistic missiles, and the image on the right there shows you their range. They could reach nearly every US city if fired as well. So now this was not an unusual thing. The United States, obviously, as we know, had missiles in West Germany, and they also had missiles in Turkey, which was on the Soviet Union's border. But this really hit hard for the United States, that this potential threat was there. In all, the crisis only lasts 13 days, 1-3, but it was the closest the world came to nuclear apocalypse at the time. Kennedy's response is significant. Obviously, he had to tread very carefully in how he approached this as well, with nuclear missiles pointing at major US cities. He sets up XCOM, so a kind of meeting with important people to discuss what they were going to do with the crisis. One group were called the Hawks. They were automatically pushing for military action, for a full-scale invasion of Cuba, but Kennedy was reluctant. He thought that this would be a declaration of war with the Soviet Union, so he wanted to tread carefully. What he chooses is to blockade Cuba with the Navy. So they surround Cuba, meaning nothing can come in and nothing can come out as well. He also speaks to the American people on a national broadcast. He tells them what the situation is. He tells them that the United States will be strong. The United States will not accept a kind of move like this from the Soviet Union and Cuba as well. So when the Soviet Navy turns up to support Cuba, they see this blockade, and they then are putting the firing line. What do? Do they push through and do they fire on the United States and declare war, or do they turn back? Their decision is to turn back, and this is why this is a really clever move by Kennedy to put the ball in the Soviets' court. Do you really want to exacerbate these tensions? Do you really want war? And they turn around. From that, he directly speaks to Khrushchev. He demands the removal of the missiles, or he will invade Cuba. Khrushchev eventually agrees, and then that leads to the agreement that they will take out the missiles from Cuba. But the missiles in Turkey do remain. So that is the end of that crisis. And this, for many historians and many people who study the Cold War, is the high point of tensions. And this is the moment where they realized that they were so close to the use of these nuclear weapons that things have to change. And what we see is, for me, this is the start of Dayton, unofficially the start of Dayton. These peaceful resolutions between the two superpowers. A year later, so in June of 1963, we see the hotline set up, and that is the telephone. So this was a direct line between the Soviet Union and Moscow and Washington, meaning that if any crises did escalate or was there was a concern it was going to start to escalate, they could directly discuss and de-escalate the tensions as well. This had never happened before. 2 months later, in August in 1963, and this is John F. Kennedy there signing this treaty, was the Test Ban Treaty, signed by the Soviet Union, the United States, and Great Britain as well. And they all agreed to ban the testing of nuclear weapons in outer space, underwater, in the atmosphere. And this is really designed to control nuclear warfare. A few years later, in 1967, the Outer Space Treaty is signed. We spoke about in the last video. The Sputnik had led to this space race, and 2 years later, the United States would land on the moon. So this put the restrictions on being able to actually use nuclear technology in space. Ronald Reagan later on with Star Wars would go against that treaty. And the following year in 1968, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty was another treaty signed which agreed to stop the spread of nuclear weapons. So if you signed up for the treaty, you could not share nuclear technology with other countries. Again, trying to limit the amount of nuclear weapons in the world, trying to prevent and try to control it as well. So the missile crisis essentially leads to a safer world. Nuclear weapons are still used. There's still an increasing amount of them. The technology develops, but there is this real concerted effort to control them from the United States and the Soviet Union from 1961, and that really is the peak of tension, is the missile crisis as well. A few years later, though, after the missile crisis, Khrushchev is actually dismissed. He's seen as weak, even despite his political victory during the Berlin crisis. He's seen ultimately by the Soviet leadership as being weak over Cuba, and he is removed from office and dismissed in 1964. And that's where we see the arrival of Leonid Brezhnev, who was a more hardliner, and this is the final crisis of the part of the course, which is the Prague Springs and the subsequent Brezhnev Doctrine. So we spoke about Czechoslovakia in the first video, and how before the Second World War they had been a democratic nation, and after the Nazi invasion and occupation of their country, they were hopeful of introducing democracy again. But Stalin knew that Czechoslovakia's geographical position was too important, with its close proximity to the West, and it was a key buffer country that he had to take control of. So a violent coup takes over the Czech government in 1948 and installs a communist one. 20 years later, people in the Czech Republic in the Czechoslovakia, are starting to become more and more disenfranchised with communism. Comecon, the Council of Mutual Assistance, had zapped a lot of the wealth and industry of Czechoslovakia, and people were poor, really. So income had begun to fall as well. Economic reforms were ineffective as well, and there was obviously lots of purges of any opposition, and lots of young people in Czechoslovakia start to believe that they want change, and this is obviously a product of the 1960s as well. So in 1968, Alexander Dubček is elected as first secretary of the Czech Communist Party. He's approved by the Soviets. They believed that he was going to be someone who could increase communist rule and its face. But Dubček does the complete opposite, and he believes that people in Czechoslovakia had the right to enjoy life. They should be able to express their views in public. They should be able to speak out against things that they don't like, that the government are doing, and he calls it socialism with a human face. He will introduce a series of reforms which will become known as the Prague Springs, Prague being the capital city of Czechoslovakia. And what he wanted to relax, as I said, censorship on television and radio and newspaper. He wanted trade unions to have more power, so they're not just being ruled and controlled by the government. He wanted trade with the West to increase because he wanted to see Czechoslovakia's economy actually improving. And he wanted to see essentially a 10-year program of political change, which would eventually lead to democracy. He felt that communism had reached its time. It wasn't working for his country by this time period, and democracy was needed. Now, his reforms are immediately rebuffed. So, as we said, Brezhnev on the left there with his big, fluffy, bushy eyebrows is the new leader of the Soviet Union. And on the 20th of August 1968, 500,000 Warsaw Pact troops invade Czechoslovakia and end the Prague Spring. There was very little opposition, so unlike during the Hungarian Revolution or uprising, where there was opposition, there is no opposition. The force that invades is too big. Brezhnev orders the Czech army to remain in its barracks, and the Czech people do very little. There were individual acts of bravery, trying to block roads or attacking individual tanks, but essentially they were no match for the Warsaw Pact troops and the Soviet troops as well. On the 26th September by 1968, the whole thing is over, and a Czech paper releases actions of the Soviet Union through what's called the Brezhnev Doctrine. And this Brezhnev Doctrine essentially said that the Soviets would never allow for any reform in Eastern Europe, that communism was a one-party state, and that they were completely justified in their invasion of the Czech Republic as well. Unsurprisingly, because of the better relations with the US and the Soviet Union by this stage, there is no US involvement as well. They were willing to sacrifice Czech freedom for better relations with the Soviets. They're not particularly interested in helping. There's public condemnation as usual. But I guess the only thing that went in the USA's favor is that the Soviets were being shown or looked like the aggressors yet again. It took away attention from the USA as being aggressors in the world. At the time, they were waging war in Vietnam, and there's lots of horrors from that. Many of you may have looked at that before. So it took away that attention from them as well. So communism was secure. The Soviets had shown that, again, they were willing to use brute force to end any sort of revolutions or reforms or insurrections. But communism was only secure for now, and the cracks were beginning to show that people did not want this way of life. Through the refugee crisis from West and East Berlin to the Prague Spring as well. And whilst the two superpowers were embarking on better relations after that peak tension of the missile crisis, and they were going to embark on détente, by the 1980s, communism really is starting to suffer and crack, and we will see, and obviously we'll discuss it in the next video, the end of the Cold War. Hopefully you found the video helpful, and please tune in next time for the last key topic, which is the end of the Cold War.